Conditions after the war. The end of World War II left the Philippines devastated. The war brought losses to the Filipino nation in terms of physical and human resources. The heavy bombing of Manila by the Americans to clear the city of Japanese hideouts destroyed infrastructure needed for the economic recovery. For many months, there was no production. According to 1951 government report, the total war losses of the Philippines encountered to more than $8 billion. There was widespread unemployment, food was scarce, and thousands died of various diseases. The total picture was discouraging and desperate. The problems that confronted the Commonwealth were a challenge to the statesmanship of President Sergio Osmeña, who took over after Quezon's death. The courage and spirit of cooperation among the people were again put to the test. The American Army in the Philippines created an agency to extend immediate aid to the Filipinos. The Philippine Civil Affairs Unit, or PCAU, was set up to help the military commanders in extending relief aid to the suffering people. The American government gave money to the Philippine government for the purchase of foodstuff, medicine, and clothing for the Filipinos. However, this money was to be paid back by the Philippine government in due time. The government reorganized. In order to make the government responsive to the immediate needs of the people, President Osmeña in March 1945 reorganized the government. After his oath-taking, Osmeña spoke of what lay ahead. He said in part, "We shall reestablish in our country a social and political system in which government officials and employees are not the masters of the people but their servants. We stand for individual liberties guaranteed by our Constitution, for the right of every man and woman to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We stand for a new world free from want and fear, provided with greater safeguards for lasting peace. We are ready to take part in close association with the United States in the organization and preservation of peace in the world." On the existing suggestion of General MacArthur, Osmeña called Congress to session to pass laws designed to help solve the serious problems of the country. On July 4, 1946, the Third Republic was inaugurated at the Luneta in Manila. Hundreds of thousands of Filipino and some American and foreign dignitaries witnessed the ceremonies. Among the distinguished American guests were General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied Power in Japan, General Millard Tydings, co-sponsor of the Philippine Independence Act, and former Governor General F.B. Harrison, the most beloved American Governor General in the Philippines. The most meaningful and solemn moment of the independence ceremonies was the raising of the Philippine flag by President Rojas and the lowering of the American flag by Ambassador McNaught to the accompaniment of the national anthems of the two nations. At this significant moment in the history of the Filipino nation, church bells throughout the Philippines were rang to announce the freedom of the Philippines. After the flag ceremony, and Vice President Elpidio Quirino again took their oath of office, this time as President and Vice President of the Third Republic of the Philippines. Thus, Rojas was recorded the last President of the Commonwealth and the first President of the Third Republic. The Rojas administration and that of his successor, Elpidio Quirino, were faced with the Hukbalahap problem. The Hukbalahap, short for Hukbo ng Bayan Laban sa Hapon, was founded early in 1942 as an anti-Japanese organization of peasants in Central Luzon. The Huks won many skirmishes with the enemy and made Central Luzon practically independent of the Japanese. The Huks became so powerful that the greedy among the landlords of Central Luzon feared them. Rojas failed to win over the Huks to his side. He therefore declared the Huks a band of outlaws. In March 1948, he declared the Hukbalahap and its peasant organization, the Pambansang Kaisahan ng mga Magbubukid, as illegal. As the second president of a young and shaky republic, Elpidio Quirino, an economist, believed that a country could not be truly independent unless it had achieved economic stability. Thus, this program focused on agricultural productivity and industrialization. He also stabilized Philippine currency by setting up the Central Bank of the Philippines. He signed into law the Magna Carta of Labor and the Minimum Wage Law. As president, he tried to win over the Hooks to the government side by sending his younger brother, a former judge, Antonio Quirino, to meet with the Hook Supremo, Luis Taruc. In the talks, Taruc asked for the following. Number 1. Scrapping of the Bell Trade Act. Number 2. No trade with Japan. Number 3. Redistribution of large estates to the peasants or tenants. Number 4. Release of all Hook prisoners. Number 5. Industrialization. And number 6. Removal of U.S. bases in the country. As a result of the Taruc-Quirino meetings, President Quirino proclaimed amnesty to all Hooks and the PKM members. For their part, promised to surrender their arms to the government authorities. Judge Quirino, however, denied ever agreeing to implement Taruc's demand. The amnesty failed and the peace that reigned in Central Luzon, known as Hooklandia, lasted only for a short duration. On the other hand, the Hooks accused the government of bad faith. The campaign against the Hooks was renewed and Central Luzon was once more become a war zone. Ramon Magsaysay was Quirino's Secretary of National Defense, worked hard to solve the Hook problem. Magsaysay adopted strict measures which included organized and simultaneous raids by the armed forces and the police to arrest Hook leaders and supporters. With the help of American money, Magsaysay won the presidency in 1953, receiving a great majority of votes. He became popular with the common people. He shook hands with them, kissed old men, women, and children of the poor, and walked in wooden clogs. In 1954, he caused the surrender of Luis Taruc, the Hook Supremo. Taruc unreservedly recognized the authority of President Magsaysay and the sovereignty of the Republic of the Philippines. Magsaysay, besides his successful campaign against the Hooks, is remembered for his policy of honest government. During his term, no friends or relatives ever benefited from his position as president. He also created extensive irrigation systems, introduced modern agricultural methods, and approved the Agricultural Tenancy Act. Because the Garcia administration could not solve the problems of rising prices and graft and corruption, Diosdado P. Macapagal, candidate of the Liberal Party for president, won the election of 1961. President Macapagal promised to solve the problem of unemployment and promote self-sufficiency in food production. He promised to set an example of honest uprightness and simple living. All these were good on paper, for while Macapagal was honest, many men around him were not. It was said that Macapagal came from a very poor family. As such, he understood their plight as well as the need to improve the status of the peasants. Consequently, he asked Congress to approve his agricultural land reform code, whose main provisions were: number 1, to establish and encourage the formation of family-sized farms as the basis of Philippine agriculture. Number 2, to improve the status of the poor farmers by freeing them from pernicious practices such as exorbitant rates of interest for loans. Number 3, to encourage bigger productivity to increase the income of small farmers. Number 4, to apply all labor's laws to all irrespective of their status in life. Number 5, to provide a land settlement program and the distribution of land. And 6, to make poor farmers independent, self-reliant, and responsible citizens in order to strengthen the Philippine democratic society. In a show of national spirit, Macapagal, through an executive order, changed the celebration of Independence Day from July 4 to June 12 of every year. The nationalists praised Macapagal's move, for in truth, Philippines' independence was proclaimed by Aguinaldo on June 12, 1898, while the proclaim on July 4 was made not by the Philippine president but by U.S. President Truman.
Proclaimed martial law in accordance with the powers vested in the President by the Constitution of the Philippines.
Yes, that is quite clear. In spite of any result of any constitutional convention, I have no intention of running for a third term. Don't you think that 2 terms is enough for any man?
Proclaimed martial law in accordance with the powers vested in the President by the Constitution of the Philippines.
I feel the earth move under my feet. I feel the sky come moving down.
Sa simula pa lamang ng 1970, kumakalat na ang usap-usapan tungkol sa mga plano ni Presidente Ferdinand Marcos. Noon ay kahahalal pa lamang ni Marcos sa kanyang ikalawang term bilang Presidente ng Pilipinas. Sa ilalim ng konstitusyong umiiral noon, 2 term lang ang Presidente. Hindi na pwedeng tumakbo si Marcos sa pagka-Presidente sa 1973. Ayon sa usap-usapan, pinaplano na ni Marcos kung paano siya mananatili sa kapangyarihan. Ang kanyang Plan A, gawing parlamentaryo ang sistema ng gobyerno. Sa gayon, kung hindi na siya pwedeng maging presidente, ay pwede pa rin siyang manungkulan bilang Prime Minister. At ang Plan B, ayon pa rin sa kumakalat na usap-usapan, ideklara ang martial law, batas militar. Sa unang term pa lamang ni Marcos, nagbigay ng babala ang isang bagong senador, si Benigno Aquino. Sa isang privilege speech, sinabi ni Aquino na sa ilalim ni Marcos, ang bansa ay unti-unting magiging garrison state, isang bansang kontrolado ng puwersang militarista. Sa pagpasok ng 1970, naglagablab ang protesta laban sa gobyerno. Ipinahayag nila ang kanilang damdamin tungkol sa iba't ibang isyu, ang pagtaas ng presyo ng gasolina at presyo ng mga bilihin, ang pananatili ng mga base militar ng Estados Unidos sa lupaing Pilipino, ang pagkontrol ng mga dayuhan sa ekonomiya ng Pilipinas, ang katiwalian at kapuluhan sa gobyerno, ang palaki ng palaking agwat sa pagitan ng mahirap at mayaman. Sa halip na reforma, dahas at brutalidad ang naging sagot ng gobyerno.
I would like to inform our people that the government has demonstrated to everyone, not only to the insurrectionary elements, but to everyone its capability to meet any threat against the seat of government and against the peace and order of our city.
Hindi takot ang naging epekto ng dahas militar, lalo lamang lumakas ang pagtutuloy.
Yung mga handles na mga placards, ginagawang pamalo. Tapos una mga bato, then hatutunan gawin ng mga pillboxes. At yung mga sumunod na pangyayari bago mag-martial law, yung tinatawag na first water storm, yun ang pinakamalaki na talagang kwento ng lusogin ng mga aktivista ang grade 6 Malacanang. So, lumabas yung mga Malacanang Presidential Guard Battalion, tinawag ang Task Force Lawit at halos sa niya, magdamag yung pitch battle diyan sa Mendiola.
Lumala ang krisis sa ekonomiya at politika. Nagkaroon ng devalwasyon at bumaba ang halaga ng pera. Maraming nawala ng trabaho. Natigil ang pag-unlad ng agrikultura at industriya. August 21, 1971. Lugar, Plaza Miranda, sa harap ng simbahan ng Quiapo sa downtown ng Maynila. Sa makasaysayang Plaza Miranda, karaniwan nagtitipon ng mga aktivista at politiko. Ang lugar na ito ay simbolo ng demokrasya at kalayaan sa pananalita. Panahon iyon ng kampanya para sa eleksyon ng mga senador. Dalawang partido politikal ang naglalaban. Ang mga nasyonalista ang nasa poder. Ang partido ng administrasyon, ang partido ni Marcos. Ang mga liberal ang nasa oposisyon. Sa rally ng Partido Liberal sa Plaza Miranda, dalawang granada ang inihagis sa entablado. Sa pagsabog ng granada, halos 100 karaniwang mamamayan ng nasugatan. Sugatan din ng mga lider ng Partido Liberal. Isa na rito si Senador Jovito Salonga.
Mahigit sa 100 piraso ng shrapnel hanggang ngayon ay nasa loob ng aking katawan. Makikita ninyo itong epekto sa mga kamay ko. Ito'y nalaglag na eh. At dito tumama ang isang malaking shrapnel na 1 millimeter short of my aorta. Ang sabi ng mga doktor, kung yun just so much as touch your aorta, patay ka na. So I missed death by only 1 millimeter.
Si Senador Benigno Aquino, ang kaaway na mortal ni Marcos, ay hindi pa nakakarating sa Plaza Miranda nang pumutok ang mga granada. Dahil dito, pinagpintangan siyang kasabwat ng mga komunista sa pambobomba sa Plaza Miranda. Isang misteryo hanggang ngayon ang insidente sa Plaza Miranda. Malakas ang suspecha noon na si Marcos mismo ang nag-utos ng pambobomba. Sa tingin ng marami, layunin niyang maghasik ng lagim at lumikha ng kaguluhan para mailatag ang pundasyon ng martial law.
I, Ferdinand Marcos, President of the Philippines, by virtue of the powers vested upon me by Article 7, Section 10, Paragraph 2 of the Constitution, do hereby suspend the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus.
Kasunod ng pambobomba sa Plaza Miranda, sinuspinde ni Marcos ang writ of habeas corpus. Ibig sabihin, kahit sino ay pwede nang ipadakip ng mga may kapangyarihan at hindi na kailangang iharap sa korte. Dahil sa lakas ng protesta laban sa writ suspension, napilitan si Marcos na ibalik ang writ of habeas corpus. Pero ang suspesyon ng writ ay parang isa ng dry run, isang pag-iensayo tungo sa deklarasyon ng martial law. Nang sumunod na taon, nagkasunod-sunod ang pambobomba. Nasugatan ng ilang mamimili sa Joe's Department Store, pero walang nasaktan sa iba pang pambobomba. Parang ang layunin lamang ay manakot sa halip na pumatay.
26, 1971, members of the New People's Army raided a tactical command post in Isabela, destroying 2 AFP helicopters.
Bukod kay Senador Aquino, ang pangunahing pinagbibintangan ni Marcos sa nangyari sa Plaza Miranda ay ang Communist Party of the Philippines o CPP na pinamumunuan ni Jose Maria Sison. Isinilang ang CPP noong 1968 sa araw pagkatapos ng Pasko. Pagkaraan ng 3 buwan, itinatag nito ang isang armadong grupo, ang New People's Army o NPA. Kabilang sa mga nagbuo ng NPA ang ilang dating FUP, mga miyembro ng Hukbong Mapagpalaya ng Pilipinas, isang grupo ng mga armadong rebelde na nakabase sa
The Philippines is a country in Southeast Asia, one that does not usually make international headlines. But in February 1986, the Philippines shot to the center of the world news by one of the most dramatic revolutions in history. For 3 tension-filled days, over 3 million Filipinos took to the streets of Manila, the capital city of the Philippines. People from all walks of life gathered together at Manila's main highway, Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, more commonly known as EDSA. The people had come to EDSA to take a stand against nearly 20 years of dictatorship and human rights violations by an unjust and corrupt leader. The Philippine EDSA revolution became world famous because, for the first time in history, no bullets were fired and no blood was spilled. Ferdinand Marcos was elected President of the Philippines in 1966. At first, Marcos seemed promising but soon turned into a dictator. The Filipinos took to the streets in protest. Marcos took advantage of the political instability and declared martial law on September 21, 1972. Marcos immediately had all his political opponents jailed. Benigno Ninoy Aquino, Marcos' strongest opponent, spent 10 years in prison and, in 1980, was granted permission to leave the Philippines to have heart surgery in the United States. In mid-1983, Ninoy Aquino announced that he was returning to the Philippines to continue the fight for freedom. On August 21, 1983, Ninoy Aquino was killed on the runway of the Manila International Airport. Marcos denied any involvement in Ninoy's assassination, but later events proved that he was behind the crime. Ninoy Aquino's assassination sparked a great uproar among the Philippine people. For the next 3 years, massive protest rallies sprang up all over the country, from the downtown business district to the countryside. Ninoy Aquino's widow, Corazon Aquino, emerged as the symbolic leader of the people's anger at the Marcos government. In November 1985, while being interviewed on the television show Nightline, Marcos was asked by ABC newsman Ted Koppel if he was still confident that he had the support of the Filipino people. In a surprise response, Marcos announced that in 3 months he would call for a snap presidential election. The candidates were to be Ferdinand Marcos and Corazon Aquino. Corazon Aquino's last campaign rally, prior to the February 7th snap elections, drew a record 1 million people. It was the largest political rally the country had ever seen. Marcos attempted to downplay Corazon Aquino's obvious amount of support.
2 days later, on February 7, 1986, the Philippine snap presidential elections took place. Reports began to circulate in the international press that the February 7th elections were among the dirtiest in history. The following day, NAMFREL held a quick count of the early election returns, showing that Corazon Aquino was leading in the polls. The official government tally had an opposite result, showing Marcos ahead of Aquino in the polls. Each side accused the other of cheating to win the elections. The situation was further inflamed when the U.S. President Ronald Reagan publicly expressed continued support for Marcos. It soon became clear that the official government election results showing Marcos leading were fraudulent. A multinational team of election observers and foreign journalists began reporting massive and widespread fraud by the ruling government party. On February 15, 1986, the Philippine Congress formally proclaimed Marcos the winner of the February 7th elections. Undaunted by Marcos's proclamation, a defiant Corazon Aquino held a victory rally in which she called for a national civil disobedience campaign. President Reagan dispatched Special Envoy Philip Habib to the Philippines in light of the rapidly deteriorating situation. After days of publicly appearing to support Marcos despite the increasing evidence of a dishonest election, the U.S. Senate on February 19th passed a declaration that the February 7th Philippine elections were marked by widespread fraud. U.S. Envoy Philip Habib held a meeting with Corazon Aquino in which she advised the U.S. envoy to wait and see what events would transpire in the next few days.
On February 22, 1986, Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile and Armed Forces Vice Chief of Staff Fidel Ramos both withdrew their support for Marcos and publicly broke away from the government. The two former Marcos men barricaded themselves in the Ministry of National Defense after learning that Marcos had ordered their arrest. The well-known Archbishop of Manila, Jaime Cardinal Sin, publicly offered to mediate between the Marcos camp and the Enrile Ramos camp. He asked the people to go out into the streets and block any movement of hostile troops. Within the hour, thousands of men, women, and children flocked to the EDSA highway, where the military camps were located.
My father and I were the first members of our family to go to EDSA, and we were there very early on. We got there were only a few hundred of us, and I was so scared to be there. I was 18. I'm thinking, what am I doing here? But as I approached the walls of the military camp, I could see through some holes in the walls, and I could see soldiers behind them. And I talked to one of them because I figured I want to make him feel safer, because I know how scared he was, because I was very scared. And I asked him what his name was, and he told me what his name was, and I asked him how old he was, and he said he was 19, and I was 18. I think that's when it really struck me that the only difference between him and me is that he had a uniform on and I didn't. But in the end, we were there for the same thing. We needed to see this through the end. We just had enough.
On the morning of February 23, 1986, the amount of people at the EDSA highway suddenly swelled up to outrageously large numbers. A large number of people brought with them the images of the Virgin Mary, and many others were praying. People came carrying picnic baskets rather than weapons for war. In the afternoon of the same day, radios broadcasted that Marcos Marines were headed towards EDSA. When the armed forces arrived, they were stopped by thousands of men, women, and children, all linking arms to block the troops. The soldiers were ordered to fire upon the people, but only shot their weapons into the air. The troops were forced to retreat, and no blood had been shed the entire time. On February 24, 1986, in the middle of a TV news conference with Marcos and his generals, the broadcast suddenly went off the air. The rebels had taken over the government-run TV station. Marcos, who had dominated the media for 20 years, suddenly had no way to communicate with the Philippine people. Meanwhile, at EDSA, the crowds had increased in numbers to over 1 million. On February 25, 1986, Ferdinand Marcos was advised by U.S. Senator Paul Laxalt that it was time to step down. Unbeknownst to his few followers, Marcos had already made plans to flee to Hawaii. Simultaneously, closer to EDSA, Corazon Aquino and her Vice President Salvador Laurel were having their inauguration as the rightful leaders of the Philippines. By nightfall the same day, U.S. Marine helicopters landed inside the palace grounds. The Marcos family left their home so quickly that crates of items were left in the palace and food was still half eaten on their plate. Within minutes, the Marcoses boarded the helicopters, which took them to Clark Air Force Base. This was the first leg of their trip to the United States.
After nearly 20 years of dictatorship, Marcos was gone. The EDSA revolution restored democracy in the Philippines. The Filipino people stood up for their freedom. They did it without shedding a single drop of blood. In the process, they became a reminder to all of us that freedom is something we can never take for granted. A few days after she became president, and in a proud moment for the Philippines, Corazon Aquino was invited to speak before a rare and almost unheard of joint session of the U.S. Congress.
3 years ago, I left America in grief to bury my husband, Ninoy Aquino. I thought I had left it also to lay to rest his restless dream of Philippine freedom. Today I have returned as the president of a free people.